Blood and whiskey stained the floorboards of the Red Dog Saloon, but the real crime was the piece of paper changing hands. For $50 and a clear debt, a mother and her newborn were sold. She expected a monster. She got a gunslinger who refused to let her break. The town of Brimstone Ridge was not a place where miracles happened. It was a place where hope went to die of thirst. For 22-year-old Clara Higgins, the harsh frontier had already stripped away her youth, her dreams, and her dignity. But as she stood in the suffocating heat of the saloon, clutching her 3-month-old son, Samuel, tightly to her chest, she realized the frontier was about to take the only thing she had left, her freedom. Across the scarred wooden table sat her husband, Bart Higgins. Bart was a man whose soul had been pickled in cheap whiskey and pawned off for gambling chips years ago. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he stared at the mountain of debts he had accrued. Across from him sat Ezekiel Cobb, a man who owned half the town and destroyed the other half. Cobb was wealthy, ruthless, and possessed a gaze that made Clara's skin crawl. He didn't want Bart's worthless patch of rocky soil. He wanted payment in flesh. "You owe me $400, Bart," Cobb drawled, his voice like grinding stones. He leaned back, his eyes drifting lazily to where Clara stood shivering in the corner despite the oppressive summer heat. "But I'm a reasonable man. I need a woman to keep my house, tend my fires, and warm my bed. Sign over her and the brat's indentures to me. We wipe the slate clean." Clara's heart stopped. She looked at her husband, pleading with her eyes, begging the man who had sworn before God to protect her to find a shred of decency. But Bart didn't even look at her. He reached for the pen, his hand shaking as he scrawled his name on the crude contract. He had sold them, just like that, for the price of spilled whiskey and bad cards. Clara and little Samuel became the property of a monster. A sickening cheer rose from the drunken patrons who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Cobb smiled, revealing yellow teeth, and stood up. He walked toward Clara, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. "Come along, Clara. You belong to me now. Best learn to be obedient, or that baby of yours might just find himself sitting outside in the winter snow." Clara backed away, her tears spilling hot and fast down her dirt-smudged cheeks. She gripped Samuel so tightly the baby began to fuss, his tiny cries cutting through the smoky air. Cobb reached out his thick, calloused hand to grab her arm. "Don't touch her." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the din of the saloon like a razor. The music stopped. The laughter died. Every head turned toward the swinging doors. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. A wide-brimmed Stetson shadowed his eyes, and a duster coat hung down to his calves, sweeping back just enough to reveal the twin Colt revolvers strapped to his thighs. He walked with a slow, deliberate grace that belonged to a predator. His face was weathered, carved by harsh winds and hard years, featuring a strong jaw and eyes the color of a winter storm. This was Gideon Cross. Cobb sneered, dropping his hand but stepping closer to Clara to assert his dominance. "This ain't your business, Cross. The transaction is legal. Bart signed them over to clear a lawful debt." Gideon didn't look at Cobb. He looked at Clara. For a fraction of a second his storm-gray eyes softened as they took in her trembling form and the crying infant pressed against her. Then his gaze snapped back to Cobb, hard and unforgiving. "A man who sells his own blood is no man at all," Gideon said softly, stepping up to the table. He reached into his coat and tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the wood. It hit with a loud metallic clink. "There's $500 in gold eagles. I'm buying the contract." Cobb's eyes widened greedily at the sight of the gold, but his pride flared. "I don't want your money, Cross. I want the girl." In a blur of motion too fast for the drunken crowd to follow, Gideon's hand flashed to his side. The cold steel barrel of his Colt was suddenly pressed hard beneath Cobb's chin, forcing the wealthy landowner to look up at the ceiling. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed like a thunderclap in the silent room. "I wasn't making an offer, Ezekiel," Gideon whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "Take the gold, leave the paper, or I'll paint this floor with what little brains you possess." Sweat beaded on Cobb's forehead. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically. Slowly he nodded. Gideon lowered the gun, snatched the contract from the table, and shoved the gold toward Cobb. Gideon turned to Clara. She shrank back, terrified. She had just been traded from a greedy snake to a lethal killer. Gideon tucked his gun away and offered his hand. "Come on," he said gruffly. "We're leaving." Having no choice, Clara followed the stranger out into the blinding afternoon sun, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had survived Bart and she had escaped Cobb. But looking at the broad, imposing back of Gideon Cross, she wondered if she had just walked into an even darker nightmare. The wagon ride out of Brimstone Ridge was suffocatingly silent. Gideon had purchased a sturdy buckboard and 2 strong draft horses, with the rest of his gold, settling Clara and Samuel in the back on a pile of soft, clean blankets. He sat on the bench, his back to her, driving the horses toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. Clara watched him with a mixture of terror and awe. For the first 2 days of their journey, Gideon barely spoke more than 3 words at a time. He would stop to let her feed the baby, turning his back and walking a respectful distance away to give her privacy. He hunted, bringing back rabbit and quail, and cooked the meals himself over an open fire, handing her the best portions before taking his own. It confused her. Men in the West did not buy women to treat them with respect. They bought them to own them. Clara waited for the inevitable moment when the whiskey would come out, when his eyes would turn dark and he would demand his money's worth. But the moment never came. On the 3rd night, they made camp in a narrow gorge flanked by towering red rock walls. The air had turned bitterly cold as they ascended into higher elevations. Clara sat by the fire, holding Samuel, trying to shield him from the biting wind. She was exhausted, her body aching, her spirit frayed to the breaking point. Gideon stood up from where he was tending the horses. He walked over to his saddlebags, pulled out his own thick, wool-lined duster coat, and walked over to her. Clara flinched instinctively, pulling her baby closer. Gideon stopped, his jaw tightening slightly at her reaction. He didn't step any closer. Instead, he gently draped the heavy coat over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, but what caught her attention was the scent leather, pine, and clean sweat. "You're shivering," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "Keep it. The boy needs you warm." "Why are you doing this?" Clara finally blurted out, the words tumbling from her lips before she could stop them. "You spent $500 on me. You bought me." "What do you want?" Gideon crouched across the fire from her, staring into the dancing flames. "I didn't buy you, Clara. I bought your freedom from a man who would have killed you. The contract is burned. You're not a slave." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "And why? Men don't just give away gold for nothing." Before Gideon could answer, the sharp snap of a twig echoed off the canyon walls. Gideon's demeanor changed instantly. The quiet, gentle man vanished, replaced by the lethal gunslinger she had seen in the saloon. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the camp into near darkness, and shoved Clara down behind a large boulder. "Keep the boy quiet," he hissed. Through the dim moonlight, Clara saw shadows moving at the edge of the gorge. It was Cobb's men. Ezekiel Cobb was too proud and too greedy to let $500 and a public humiliation go unanswered. He had sent his hired guns to retrieve the gold, the woman, and kill the cowboy. "Cross," a voice yelled from the darkness, a man named Rufus, known for his cruelty. "We got you surrounded. Throw out the gold and the girl, and we might just shoot you quick." Gideon didn't reply. He melted into the shadows, moving with terrifying silence. Clara huddled against the cold rock, pressing her lips against Samuel's soft head, praying the baby wouldn't cry. The first gunshot shattered the night, accompanied by a scream of pain. Then absolute chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes lit up the canyon like lightning. Clara clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face as the deafening roar of gunfire echoed off the stone. She heard men shouting in panic, horses whinnying, and the steady, rhythmic crack, crack, crack of Gideon's revolvers. He wasn't just defending them, he was dismantling the ambush with cold, calculated precision. Within 3 minutes, the canyon fell deathly silent. Clara held her breath, trembling violently. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, approaching her hiding spot. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the worst. "It's over," Gideon's voice came through the dark, slightly breathless. Clara opened her eyes. Gideon was standing over her. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, a dark stain of blood spreading across the fabric, but his eyes were entirely focused on her and the baby. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "No," she whispered. "You're bleeding." Gideon looked down at his shoulder, as if he hadn't noticed the bullet graze. "It's a scratch." He reached up with his uninjured hand to unbutton the top of his bloodied shirt to inspect the wound. As the fabric parted, something caught the moonlight. Clara gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Hanging from a leather cord around Gideon's neck was a silver locket. It wasn't just any locket. It was uniquely engraved with a rising sun over a mountain peak. Clara's breath hitched. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. Gideon paused, looking down at the silver piece resting against his chest. When he looked back up at Clara, the hardened walls he kept up seemed to fracture, revealing a profound, haunting sadness. "I made a promise to a dying man at Gettysburg," Gideon said softly, his voice thick with the past he couldn't outrun. "A man named Thomas Miller. He made me swear that if I survived the war, I would find his little sister and make sure she was safe." Clara stared at him, the world spinning around her. Thomas was her older brother. He had gone to fight in the war 10 years ago and never came back. She had thought she was entirely alone in the world. "I've been looking for you for a long time, Clara," Gideon whispered. The revelation hung in the frigid night air, heavier than the gunpowder smoke that still clung to the canyon walls. Clara dropped to her knees in the dirt, her trembling fingers reaching out to touch the cool, blood-flecked silver of the locket resting against Gideon's chest. The rising sun over the mountain peak. It was the exact crest their father had carved into the wooden beam of their childhood porch in Missouri before the cholera took him. "Thomas," Clara choked out, a sob finally tearing through her chest. The brother she had mourned for a decade had spent his dying breaths thinking of her. "He sent you. He made me swear it, Clara," Gideon said, his voice stripped of its hard edge, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. He winced as he shifted, the bullet graze on his shoulder seeping dark crimson into his torn shirt. "It took me years to track his letters, to find the trail you left when you moved west with Bart Higgins. When I finally rode into Brimstone Ridge, I found you on an auction block. I was almost too late." Clara shook her head, pulling a clean rag from her bundle of belongings to press against his bleeding shoulder. "You weren't too late. You saved us." As she bound his wound, the terrifying reality of the gunslinger shifted into something entirely different. He wasn't a monster who had purchased her. He was a guardian angel bathed in blood and dust. They rode hard for the next 4 days, pushing deep into the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the San Juan Mountains near Durango, Colorado. The landscape grew breathtakingly beautiful and intensely unforgiving. Towering pines scraped against the endless blue sky, and the air turned crisp and thin. Gideon had built a homestead, here a sturdy fortified cabin constructed of thick timber nestled beside a rushing crystal-clear creek. It was a fortress of solitude, designed to keep the world out. Now it was a sanctuary. For the first time in years, Clara felt safe. The ensuing weeks felt like a fever dream of peace. Gideon was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He chopped endless cords of wood to keep the cabin warm. He hunted elk and foraged for wild berries, ensuring Clara had enough to eat so she could nurse little Samuel. Most surprisingly, the hardened killer showed a remarkable tenderness toward the infant. Often Tara would wake in the early dawn to find Gideon sitting by the hearth, rocking a fussy Samuel to sleep, his massive calloused fingers gently tracing the baby's tiny hands. But the tranquility was a fragile veneer over a dark, boiling truth. One evening, as the autumn wind howled against the log walls, Gideon sat at the heavy oak table, the silver locket open under the glow of a kerosene lantern. Clara sat across from him, mending a torn shirt. "There is something you need to know, Clara," Gideon said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. He reached into the open locket and used the tip of his hunting knife to pry away the inner silver lining. From behind the metal, he extracted a tiny, tightly folded square of oilcloth. Clara leaned in, her brow furrowed. "What is that?" Gideon unfolded the cloth carefully. It was a map drawn in faded ink, accompanied by an official assayer's stamp. "Before Gettysburg, your brother spent 2 years prospecting in these very mountains. He struck a vein of silver, a massive one. He hid the deed and the coordinates inside this locket and sent it to me for safekeeping before the battle, knowing he was marching into a slaughter." Clara stared at the map, the pieces of a terrifying puzzle suddenly snapping together in her mind. Her breath hitched. "Ezekiel Cobb." Gideon nodded grimly. "Cobb wasn't just a cruel man looking for a housemaid. He's a land baron. He has spies everywhere, even in the assay offices. He knew Thomas Miller had a sister, and he knew she was the legal heir to one of the richest unmined silver veins in Colorado. And Bart," Clara whispered, her blood running cold as she thought of her husband. "Bart is a gambling addict with a weak spine," Gideon replied, his jaw tightening. "Cobb likely figured out who you were, cornered Bart, and offered to wipe his debts if he handed you over. And Cobb wanted to marry you, Clara, legally. Once you were his wife, the silver claim would belong to him." Clara felt sick. She had been sold for a fortune she didn't even know she possessed. Her own husband had traded her to a tyrant for gambling chips and cheap liquor. But the horror was quickly replaced by a sudden, icy realization. "Gideon," she said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, "if Cobb knows about the silver, and he knows I didn't die in that canyon, he won't stop hunting us," Gideon finished for her, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, protective intensity. "He'll bring an army next time. Then we have to run," Clara urged, standing up and looking toward the crib where Samuel slept. "We have to leave the mountains." Gideon stood slowly, his hand resting on the polished wood of the table. He looked at Clara, rarely looked at her, taking in the fire in her eyes. The strength she had regained, the fierce love she held for her child. He realized in that moment that he was no longer just fulfilling a promise to a dead soldier. He was fighting for a woman who had stolen his heart. "No," Gideon said, his voice a low, unyielding rumble. "I am done running, and you are done being hunted. This is your land, Clara. This is Samuel's home. If Ezekiel Cobb wants to take it, he'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands." The first snow of the season fell heavy and fast, blanketing the San Juan Mountains in a pristine layer of white. It was beautiful, but to Gideon, it was a tactical disadvantage. It meant tracks were easy to follow, and the silence of the woods amplified every snapped twig. They arrived on a Tuesday morning. The warning came not from a shout, but from the sudden, frantic barking of Gideon's hounds, followed immediately by the sickening crack of a rifle. The dogs fell silent. Gideon was out of his chair in a flash, kicking the heavy oak table over to form a barricade. He tossed a Winchester repeating rifle to Clara, who caught it with trembling but determined hands. He grabbed his own Sharps rifle and strapped his twin Colts to his thighs. "Get in the root cellar with the boy," Gideon ordered, moving toward the front window and peering through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. Outside, the tree line was swarming with men. There were at least 20 of them, heavily armed and wearing the thick winter coats of Cobb's hired regulators. Sitting on a black stallion at the center of the posse was Ezekiel Cobb, looking furious and impatient. And beside him, shivering and looking utterly pathetic, was Bart Higgins. "I'm not hiding, Gideon," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. She checked the chamber of the Winchester, the metallic click echoing in the tense cabin. "He is my husband. He sold my child. I am fighting." Gideon looked at her over his shoulder. He saw no panic, only a mother's righteous fury. He gave her a single sharp nod of respect. "Stay low. Only shoot what comes through the doors or windows." "Cross!" Cobb's voice echoed across the snowy clearing, amplified by a tin megaphone. "I know you're in there. I've got the law on my side. Higgins here says you kidnapped his lawful wife and child. Send the woman out, hand over the locket, and I'll let you ride away." "He's lying," Kara whispered. "He'll slaughter you the second you step out." "I know," Gideon replied calmly. He smashed the glass of the window with the butt of his rifle, rested the barrel on the sill, and took aim. Gideon didn't bother shouting back. He let his Sharps rifle do the talking. The gun roared, spitting fire and smoke. 50 yards away, the megaphone in Cobb's hand shattered into a dozen pieces. Cobb screamed in terror, dropping from his horse and scrambling into the snow as his men opened fire. The world erupted into deafening chaos. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the cabin, shattering pottery and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Gideon moved with terrifying efficiency, firing, reloading, and firing again. Every time his rifle cracked, a man in the tree line dropped. He was a demon of the old war, unleashed once more in the freezing snow. But there were too many of them. "They're flanking the rear." Clara yelled over the din, spotting shadows moving past the kitchen window. She leveled her Winchester and fired through the glass. A man cried out and tumbled off the back porch. Suddenly, the heavy back door of the cabin was kicked open. The freezing wind howled into the room, bringing with it a figure clutching a revolver. It was Bart. He looked deranged, his eyes wild, his coat covered in snow. He spotted the crib in the corner where Samuel was crying in terror. "I'm taking my property back," Bart screamed, lunging toward the baby. "Step away from my son," Clara roared. She swung the Winchester around, but Bart was too fast. He grabbed the barrel of her rifle, wrenching it to the side. The gun went off, blowing a hole in the ceiling. Bart backhanded her hard, sending Clara crashing to the floorboards. Bart turned back to the crib, reaching his greedy hands toward the screaming infant. Clara tasted blood in her mouth. She didn't reach for the dropped rifle. Instead, her hand desperately felt along the floorboards until her fingers wrapped around the handle of the cast-iron skillet she had dropped when the shooting started. With a primal scream, Clara scrambled to her knees and swung the heavy iron with all the strength she possessed. The skillet connected with the side of Bart's head with a sickening crack. Bart collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, hitting the floor and not moving. Clara stood over him, her chest heaving, wiping the blood from her lip. She had finally freed herself from her greatest nightmare. A sudden, eerie silence fell over the cabin. The gunfire from outside had stopped. Clara spun around, terrified that Gideon had fallen, but Gideon was standing by the front door, his twin Colts drawn, smoke drifting lazily from the barrels. The front door was wide open. Lying on the porch, bleeding into the white snow, was Ezekiel Cobb. The rest of his men, seeing their employer dead, and their numbers decimated by the relentless gunslinger, had broken and fled into the woods. Gideon slowly lowered his weapons. He turned to look at Clara. She was bruised, covered in dust, standing victoriously over the man who had tormented her, breathing heavily. To Gideon, she had never looked more beautiful. He crossed the room, stepping right over Bart's unconscious body, and pulled Clara into his arms. She dropped the skillet and buried her face in his chest, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. The adrenaline faded, leaving only tears of profound relief. "It's over," Gideon murmured into her hair, his rough hands stroking her back. "They're gone. You're safe." "We're safe," Clara corrected him softly, looking up into his storm-grey eyes. "You aren't just a promise anymore, Gideon. You're our family." Gideon smiled, a genuine, warm expression that erased the years of war from his face. He kissed her forehead, then walked over to the crib and gently scooped the crying Samuel into his massive arms, hushing the baby with quiet, soothing words. The frontier was a cruel and unforgiving place built on blood and stolen dreams. But high in the San Juan Mountains, a new legacy had begun. The debt was paid, the past was buried in the snow, and the silver in the earth was nothing compared to the gold they had found in each other. If Clara and Gideon's fight for survival and love in the unforgiving West kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling tale of frontier drama, heartbreak, and redemption. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.